Good. Thank you very much, Toby, and good morning to you. I'm conscious that this will probably be the only opportunity that I'll have to speak to my report, so I thought I'd go through the conclusions and then the recommendations and try and give you as much of a feel for that. I can elaborate on some other parts of the report, such as the about women and the culture, the documentation that I found. I'd just like at the very beginning to be quite clear that I was given terms of reference for the exercise, and I focused very much on looking at reviewing the Welington Rugby Union and looking at how they dealt with the case, looked at what they had available to them and through their eyes. And I think that it's important you understand that. I was not looking at it from a national perspective down. I was looking at it from inside the Welington Rugby Union as to the material they had to deal with a case like this. So that's how I've focused on it. And I've confined my review to the documentation that they had available to them. I went through that very carefully and confined it very much to the time frame of the Filipo case. So I didn't deal with what documentation might be there now. I looked at purely what was available at the time. And I also, at the beginning, I think it's important you understand that Welington Rugby have 40 professional members in their area, 11,000 amateur players, 1,200 women, and thousands of volunteers at the grassroots level, many of whom are women. And at the very top, there are only men. So that's the environment that I was looking at. There are a few paid officials, and there's very much an attitude that everyone is welcome and no one is turned away. So if I can go back to the conclusions, I reviewed the processes, the protocols and procedures that Welington Rugby Football Union had in place to manage situations such as the Filipo case, and the extent to which they were applied in relation to that case. They had a promising player who had committed a very serious offence and faced hostility and public outrage. They had consistently supported Mr. Filipo as he developed social and life skills as well as rugby skills. They believed that Judge Davidson appeared to encourage the success of their support and the continuation of it. And I've concluded that the Welington Rugby Football Union, faced with an extremely difficult situation, managed it as well as could be expected. They did not have a robust set of documents governing the expectations of players' behaviour, misconduct, or penalties that were able to be consistently applied. The documents governing misconduct do not reflect public expectations and need a major overhaul. They fall short of today's standards. The Welington Rugby Football Union stance that off-field behaviour is not their concern is outdated, given that it is this behaviour that is bringing rugby into disrepute. Urgent action to set standards for off-field behaviour and to bring off-field misconduct under their disciplinary processes as needed. The new standards should apply to everyone associated with the Welington Rugby Football Union, including paid staff and volunteers. Welington Rugby Football Union rugby players and supporters represent every section of New Zealand society, and yet it is predominantly men who administer the game, thus perpetuating a dominantly male culture. It is timely to engage some of the numerous women supporters and volunteers within the union to bring a wider perspective to the decision-making forums, particularly as they relate to behaviour. So they're the conclusions. Now I can carry on and go through the recommendations. Would you find that useful? The first recommendation is that the Welington Rugby Football Union resolves to embark on the leadership of a 10-year culture change. And I say 10 years because in my experience of the big culture changes that I've been involved with over the last 50 years, that they take about 10 years to actually affect when you're dealing with very hard, entrenched cultures. So that plan should commit future leaders to build on a consistent approach within a defined timeline. The development of the plan should be undertaken by rugby people, but with input from personnel experts experienced in culture change, and including women, and women who do not have formal involvement with the sports world. And I've suggested several times that they really look at empowering the thousands of women that they have at the grassroots of their organisation and bring some of those women up to the top. The women that are in touch with grassroots New Zealand and the attitudes that are in today's society. And those people will bring an ordinary common sense perspective. The plan should state players' responsibilities on and off the field to be good citizens and not to act contrary to the best interests of rugby, to abide by the laws they are required to abide by, and to uphold the attitudes and standards of behaviour expected of players. A new framework of the standards, systems, processes and practices for player behaviour and a zero tolerance for serious misconduct should be included. And there should be regular monitoring and auditing of progress over that 10-year plan development, and that should be publicly reported. The second recommendation, that a task force of Welington Rugby Football Union people, personnel, experts and women who will bring an ordinary common sense perspective be appointed. This task force should undertake a review of all standards, policies, systems, procedures and sections of the organisation in regard to dealings with players, paid staff and volunteers, and design a new system that covers all policies and documents, including player attitudes, culture and standards of behaviour on and off the field, processes and procedures for recruitment, selection, induction and management of players' performance, and disciplinary processes which include the application of a zero tolerance for serious misconduct should all be covered. And ways of gaining the involvement of the wider community in standard setting and keeping policy relevant to community trends and expectations should be covered. And that the task force recommended in that recommendation develop a code of conduct that sets out the required standards of behaviour for everyone covered by the Welington Rugby Union, It must be designed to take into account the values and concerns of today's society. It should include the requirements that the players be good citizens who comply with the law governing their conduct both on and off the field. And this moving into having concern for off-the-field behaviour is the big shift. There's plenty of focus on what happens on the field, but I couldn't find any mention of drunkenness, violence, inappropriate sexual behaviour, which are the concerns today. And it should, as I've just covered there, and the review should also state a zero tolerance and set out the penalties that will apply, so that if they're dealing with misconduct, they're quite clear about what penalties there should be. It should be written in unequivocal language and used in all documents, so that there's a clear, consistent message always conveyed. The fourth recommendation that all committees and panels with a responsibility for player recruitment, engagement, standard systems and processes, including disciplinary action, have at least 2 women members who again will bring an ordinary common sense perspective to the decision-making table. And the fifth recommendation is that a system to manage all the documents covering player management, behaviour, misconduct and disciplinary processes be developed. A register of all documents be established with one person responsible for it, and that a manual, they have something like a manual which is written in consistent language that can be easily followed and understood by administrators, players and public. I found that there was documents from all over the place. There's documents from international bodies. There's a collective about this thick collective agreement, which someone has described as dense, and someone else told me it was like reading War and Peace. But the chances of someone at the grassroots actually understanding it or being able to find their way around it, and is not very satisfactory. And so I think it's for Welington Rugby Union to just take hold of the documents and get them into one system that they have some control over, and that will make life much simpler. Because I found when I started to probe in that it was suggested from outside bodies that there were other documents that had never got to Welington Rugby Union, had never been seen by them. So it's a bit of a shambles. And the sixth recommendation is that Welington Rugby Football Union be commended on the approach they are taking to the challenges facing today's youth, and of particular note is the work being done and support given to young people to ensure they develop life skills and standards of behaviour that society expects of top rugby players. Now, some of you will be aware that I've spent a lot of my working life in the social sector. I was Director General of Social Welfare for a number of years, and I was really impressed with the work that is being done in rugby, in taking young people in. Often their policy of everyone is welcome means they take people in who often don't have family support, don't have life skills. And there are, throughout the Welington Rugby Union region, there are mentors, people working it alongside those young people and work with them, usually with huge success. And I think it must be one of the few groups in New Zealand that do that and take that trouble, and it's a part of the culture that I don't think is very well known about in New Zealand, and I think it's quite marvellous when we read all the time about these young people who don't get that support, where most of the people that rugby are working with go on to succeed and participate in the sport and therefore succeed and participate in society. And I think that's really exciting. I got some current figures from the Ministry of Social Development, and they tell me that out of 10,000 clients that they surveyed, there were 920 of them that cost over $1 million a year to the taxpayer. So I think what rugby is doing on a voluntary basis is quite tremendous in terms of our society, and I commend them for that. So that's the end of the recommendations. I can leave it at that or elaborate if you want to follow up.
Take some questions, is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I was going to ask, one of your conclusions was that Wellington Rugby managed it as well as could be expected. So you're saying there's no individual failings from management, it was more a structural problem?
It's the lack of documentation and clear guidance, and New Zealand Rugby said for them to manage it, but they really didn't have the complete set of documents to manage it. And so I think, certainly it was not done well, but they did it as well as the instructions said. There was nothing about how you deal with drunkenness and violence, for example, either for players or for the managers. So I think they did as well as they could. And
were you surprised to find that there was nothing about that?
Yes, very, very surprised, because, well, I've always been in an employment situation, and it's always quite clear that you have a code of conduct so that in terms of natural justice everyone knows what is expected and how you deal with it. But it's symptomatic of a culture that has grown over 137 years.
That 10-year time frame, do you think it's too long? What do you think? I mean, some people might look at that and say a decade seems like a very long time to get what seems like a pretty big problem under control. Can you just explain that idea around the time frame?
I was very involved with the police inquiry. I've just been to a function to commemorate 10 years since where they got to from that inquiry, and they're about there. So you've got to recognise, I think the important thing is to recognise you don't rush out and say, we're doing this, we've done it, and that's it, because that's not how it works. You've actually got to work on making sure every one of those thousands of people change their behaviour. And so that is big, long term. I think the Defence Force, I've been at it for about 20 years. So I think what you've got to do, set that 10-year, where you want to be in 10 years, and get your plan to get there. And a lot of the activity's got to happen right now. That these various committees and getting documentation, getting women involved, it's got to happen right now. But the administration have got to keep on articulating and managing the process to ensure it is completed in 10 years.
So what you're saying is it's such an ingrained culture.
Yeah.
So would you compare it to what the culture was like at
police? It's similar, and Defence will be the same. There's long-term male groups, and I'm not being critical of men. I've been in groups of women that it's just the same. You have all women. You've got to have a mixture of men and women if you're going to get the full spectrum of input, and that's what is lacking. There's plenty of women doing marvellous things at the bottom, in schoolboy rugby. If those women were at the top board table, and were part, if they'd been part of this case, it'd be quite a different situation.
And it's obviously something that's ingrained in culture, rugby culture throughout the whole country. Would you recommend that other unions take up this sort of opportunity to have reviews themselves as well? Do you think this is something that goes a lot deeper than just in Wellington?
Oh yes, this is not just Wellington, but I think that I was really impressed with the way the leadership, particularly Ian and Steve, just embraced what has to be done. And the board when I briefed the board, they were very enthusiastic. Particularly getting women in, really coming to terms with the very extreme off-field behaviour. We're not expecting, I don't expect they'll control every aspect of off-field behaviour, but the big, newsworthy items have got to come under control.
Just on that, you say you're impressed with the work being done by the union to help, young guys that are perhaps in a, have had a hard start to life, sort of get their lives on track. Do you think that's what they were doing here with Losi, and they thought that they were trying to help him out? And do you think maybe this has been a bit of a trial by media for him?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I at the end I was really impressed with the way they stood by him, particularly over that. There was a 10-month period while that court case came. If they hadn't stood by him, his situation could be quite different.
In fairness though, Dame Margaret, it went in, that story went through the media, and within a day, by mutual consent, his contract with the Welington Rugby Football Union did end. And do you still feel that that was an appropriate way to deal with the issue?
Well, I don't think they had much choice with what they were dealing with, that there was such a public uproar. They had to deal with it very...
But surely though, if they were sticking by him, they would have kept him on.
Well, I don't
or
think...
at least made efforts to do so.
I think that they were on a very fine line. There was, I think some of the biggest public outpouring at that time. It was very, very difficult to cope with. I think that what they did was right. They still stood by him.
His relationship, I could just point out, his relationship was that the mutual termination related to a sort of an employment or contractual relationship. It wasn't termination. He hasn't been cast out of rugby.
But you can see how people would feel that by looking at the facts that he presented to us, that there is that perspective, and that people could see, hey, it went massive, and then the next day he was cut loose.
Yeah, but he, as I say, he hasn't been cast out of the rugby community, and because we don't believe that that's what Dame Margaret's suggesting, that people who transgress are cast out of a community. But it may be that there has to be a change in their status within the community for a time while they are rehabilitated, or while they undergo, or while they demonstrate that they are up to the values and standards that the community expects from them.
One of the recommendations was to have zero tolerance for serious misconduct. So does that mean, in a situation like, say this happened again with another player in the future, would you terminate their contract straight away? Is that what that means?
It's zero tolerance of the behaviour, not zero tolerance of the individual. Yeah. So what Dame Margaret has found is that we had gaps in our knowledge and systems and processes, and those gaps still exist, but we now need to close the gaps, improve and strengthen our systems and processes, and any future incident would pass into that new system which Dame Margaret has articulated. That's what would change, and then that system and process would, I guess, make that assessment as to how that applies.
So back to the point before, I mean, at the time when the contract was terminated with mutual consent, at the time we also did say that we do have a duty of care. So that duty of care remained for that particular player, even from that date. And that's like every other rugby player. So as Ian said, that you can get a situation where the behaviour is absolutely not acceptable. Does that mean that rugby casts that player away from the sport? No, it doesn't, because we have a duty, responsibility of duty of care, which I think that sport in general, rugby in particular, plays a really good part in society to actually deliver that message.
So what is his link right now as of today with the union? What contact do you have with him? What relationship? Can you characterise it for us?
The Players Association, they have people on the ground in Wellington, and they have regular contact with Losi. Wellington's also, rugby is also maintaining contact in regards to ensuring his general well-being, looking at different life skills, employment, all those sorts of things, to try and open up opportunities in that place, just to keep the person. While he is rehabilitating, he's got a sentence that he needs to go through, and obviously we'll then judge it after that in regards to what happened going forward.
Steve, do you think you provided enough support to him? Because obviously we've heard that he fled to Brisbane a few days after the situation came to light, which to me would indicate that he was feeling the pressure as well.
I don't think that's quite correct. I think that was part of the Wellington Rugby Union's support for him.
Oh, I'm just asking, I'm not making a judgment either way.
He was under pressure, clearly. Like, how could anyone not be, given the circumstances? We worked with his mentor and caregivers and the people that he does have around him, some of whom are from rugby and some are not, from outside rugby. So we've kept in regular contact with them to ensure that we help where we can, but circumstances dictated that the situation had to change at that time.
I think you've got to just keep the balance, because there's another side to the story as well, and that's from the victim's perspective. And I'm not suggesting that rugby always keeps everyone on regardless. I think this is where I think it's important to have a common sense perspective of more getting some women on the group to decide very carefully, because there will be some times when it's not appropriate for the person to carry on with rugby.
So do you think that management has perhaps been too blasé about this sort of thing in the past, and it's just that this has come to light, or do you think this was a misguided, trying to help a young kid who'd had a rough start in life?
No, I think that approach was right. I don't think it was misguided.
So they did the right thing in contracting him and knowing his past?
Well, they have a policy of everyone being welcome, and when you look, there are people from all walks of life. When you're just looking around the board table, you see, if you go to a rugby club, there are people from the most educated, most wealthy families, and from people that don't have any family support. But they're all welcome, and over the 137 years, these older men have moulded that group together to form the rugby culture as we know it today. And I think that's the rugby people are driven by never giving up an opportunity of getting a top player, but in being driven in that way, they're also providing a great social service by taking a lot of people in that would never get the opportunity to participate in our society, and I think that's highly commendable.
Look, I think there are three strands as well. Like, there's the criminal justice system, which we generally said, the criminal justice system processes sit over there. They're certainly not something that we manage or control. There's also the employment relationship. As in the last 20 years since professional rugby has developed, there's been a development of an employment relationship, and New Zealand Rugby are doing, have got a lot of good systems and support in around that small number of people that are professionals. But the larger number of people in rugby are players, administrators, coaches and referees, etc., who are volunteers. And what we're understanding, what Dame Margaret is challenging us with, and it applies and you can apply in the case that we're talking about, but it applies everywhere, is that we have to not just say, oh, it's an employment issue or it's a criminal justice issue. We have to say, where there is a credible perception of a link to rugby, then it is an issue for rugby, and we have to have a system that manages that. Now, if we had that in place, there would have been a different process. So that's what we're looking forward to moving forward with.
So, and what would that different process have looked like in hindsight?
Okay, so we would have that. One of the recommendations relates to the establishment of something like a conduct review committee, which would have a couple of women on it, and people sort of that are independent, if you like, from the union. When cases are brought to our attention, it would go there, and then that group would look at it and go, irrespective of the criminal justice system and irrespective of the employment relationship, what's best? How does this look from a rugby perspective, and what sanctions should be applied, if any? What processes? And they would do that. In all likelihood, there would be some sort of suspension while that was undertaken. But it would give confidence, I think, to people, not the victims in this case. It would also give confidence, hopefully will give confidence to the players and participants themselves that there's a fair and robust system that would make that assessment.
Dave, Margaret, I just want to touch on the context of this case, I guess, in the rugby culture across New Zealand, and what sort of precedent does this set going forward?
My report?
The fact that following this inquiry, you've recommended, a 10-year plan and a total overall.
I'm confident that this is going to be done in Wellington. I'm also confident, because of the concern across the whole country, that the rest of the country won't sit back and let Wellington be the shining star who's dealing with this. If one part of the country starts to do something, it will follow, I'm sure. And if rugby doesn't do it, the general public will make sure it happens. They're not going to tolerate this sort of behaviour.
Ian, do you have a woman on your board currently?
We do not.
Is that something you're going to look to change?
We have to.
And how are you going to go about that?
We do have a constitutional process, but we need to look at the suitability of that in the light of these recommendations. We need to be more vigorous in terms of attracting women, and I think we need to change our perception of we need to tweak our perception in terms of what a skill set is. And knowing the rugby club environment doesn't have to be a core attribute for a board member. Knowing other things, and I think that's something that we would have to confess that we've been guilty of.
How soon do you think you might move on that?
With the board, we have received these recommendations and have accepted them, so we'll be making a plan as quick as we can. So some bits will be achieved more rapidly than others, but we'll be moving on it as quickly as we possibly can.
How do you ensure that this doesn't turn into just a token measure?
I think Dame Margaret's covered that in her by saying you've got to have a plan, and culture change does take a while, but we should report. So it's anticipated that we would report this each year as part of our own annual reporting process. We have our own KPIs. Well, I can imagine that in the future we will have one of the areas that we report on will relate to Dame Margaret's findings.
Do any of the Wellington Rugby clubs have women on their boards?
Yes, they do. So Dame Margaret's point that there are many hundreds and thousands of women that are involved with rugby. A number of rugby clubs, or many rugby clubs, have women on their committees and boards. So
Upper Hutt has a chairman or president. What's the Upper Hutt?
Chair, yeah, chair. The chair of. So yeah, there are women who are active in at that level of governance.
will you be aiming to asking those to step up, or will you perhaps look for outside rugby?
Both. I think both. There are people who have club rugby knowledge, who would be really useful. But I think as well we need to we need to expand our definition of, bringing experience to the board.
Ian, have you ever considered in the past that not having women on the board was a problem, or has it taken this inquiry to draw that to your attention?
No, it has been considered. We've had discussions about it at the board table for the last few years about diversity, and we have, I guess, failed to turn that into change. It's always been, easier to take a really good candidate. But funny enough, most of those candidates end up looking rather like me.
Has anyone approached you perhaps to put their hand up?
Not in the last little while, but we have turned our minds more actively to processes that will draw people in. Mm.
The women are there. When you look at it, as a pyramid, the women are there are thousands of women in the organisation. It's just that when you get near the top, they don't get there. So it's a matter of working out how you pull them up, and because they're there and they're available tomorrow.
Mm.
And rugby's very fortunate to have that huge resource, because other male-dominated workforces I've dealt with had to start going out and trying to persuade people to come in, where it's there, alive and well in rugby.
Sometimes there needs to be a catalyst for change, and I think a couple of the questions you've asked around that, like why now. So I think if you look at any sort of social change, or quite often there's a catalyst for it. Well, arguably we should have been ahead of that, not required the catalyst, but we've got it. Dame Margaret's done a great job in terms of challenging us with what we do, so that's the catalyst for change for us. So, yeah.
I think rugby's actually in a really good position to actually embrace women at high levels in the game. I mean, I spent nearly 40 years in the corporate world, and similar challenges were faced there. And it's taken a long time in the corporate world to get people to the front table. We actually have women in our game that actually want to be involved. We now just need to embrace that change and get people involved.
Thanks, guys. So if there's no more questions, as I said...
I have one more. How possible is it that Losi will be brought back into the fray on contract with them?
Well, he has to do several things. One is he has to complete his sentence. Two is he has to demonstrate that he is, over that time, acting in a manner which is consistent with our expectations. And three, he has to be demonstrate that he's the on-field, has the on-field quality as well. So he has to do all those things, and then it can be assessed. But if he can't fail in any one of those three.
So you wouldn't rule him out, bring him back as a contracted player at some point in the future?
No, we haven't cast him out. He's I guess in a hiatus, while he demonstrates that his suitability.
Has he expressed an interest in wanting to come back?
Yep, he's expressed an interest insofar as he wants to remain in the game of rugby, and he wants to remain in the rugby community, and that he understands that he needs to demonstrate those, he has to fulfil those three things. Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you.